The living room was softly lit, shadows settling in the corners as dusk crept in through the large bay windows. I was curled up on the sofa, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling I'd carried all evening. It was another quiet night. My husband had left on a work trip. The house felt hollow without his presence, but I'd grown used to that emptiness over the years. He was a good man, practical and dependable, yet as the years passed, our conversations had shifted from love and dreams to schedules and reminders. Tonight, though, there was a flutter of something unusual within me. It was hard to place until I remembered David's visit earlier that day. My husband's friend David had been coming over for years. His visits were always filled with easy laughter, stories from his recent travels, and his knack for making anyone feel at ease. But recently I'd noticed a shift in how I looked at him, and it troubled me. The doorbell chimed, breaking the silence. I rose, smoothing my sweater as I crossed the room, and opened the door to find David standing there, hands tucked casually in his pockets, a smile playing on his lips. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," he said, holding up a small bag. "I realized I left this here earlier." "Oh, no problem at all," I replied, stepping aside to let him in. There was something about his presence that filled the empty spaces, his warmth bringing life back into the room. "Thanks," he said, stepping in and looking around. His gaze settled on me, and I felt a strange thrill, a momentary, subtle awareness of the space between us. As David entered, I became acutely aware of the quietness enveloping us, the soft hum of the heater, and the stillness broken only by the occasional crackle of the fireplace embers. I took a seat on the sofa, expecting him to say a quick goodbye and leave, but instead he lingered by the doorway, hesitating, as if there was something unspoken on his mind. I was just about to make some tea," I offered, the words spilling out before I'd thought them through. "Would you like some?" A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, and he nodded, stepping farther into the room. "Sure, I'd love some." I moved to the kitchen, feeling his presence as he trailed behind. The air between us seemed charged, like static electricity, waiting for the right moment to spark. I busied myself with the kettle, taking deliberate breaths to steady the fluttering in my chest. I could sense David watching me, and the weight of his gaze made me feel exposed in a way that was strangely exhilarating. I'd never been so conscious of every small movement, reaching for the tea canister, the sound of water pouring into the kettle, even the subtle scent of the Earl Grey as it steeped. When I turned to hand him his cup, our fingers brushed, and I felt a warm jolt rush through me. It was a small thing, just an accidental touch, but it seemed to linger, making the air feel heavy and thick. I met his eyes, and for a split second, neither of us looked away. His eyes, usually so light-hearted and filled with laughter, held something different now, an intensity I hadn't seen before. "Thanks," he murmured, taking the cup from my hands, his fingers wrapped around it, and he seemed to pause, hesitating, as if weighing some unspoken thought. We returned to the living room, each sip of tea feeling like it was buying us time, giving us an excuse to linger a little longer. He sat beside me on the sofa, closer than he normally would, close enough that our knees almost touched. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, and with every slight shift our arms brushed. It felt as if the universe had conspired to put us in this moment, each accidental touch drawing us closer to a line neither of us had planned on crossing. "Sarah," he began softly, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to fill the entire room. He looked down, seemingly grappling with his thoughts, then looked up, his gaze piercing into mine. "You seem different lately." The comment took me by surprise. "Different? How so?" He shrugged, a soft, almost rueful smile playing on his lips. "I don't know. It's just, there's something about you tonight. It's like you're more alive, maybe." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, and I looked away, unsure of how to respond. He was seeing me in a way I hadn't been seen in years. His words, simple as they were, made me feel noticed, made me feel wanted. I could feel my heart pounding, the rhythm growing faster, and when I finally met his gaze again, there was a glint in his eyes, a warmth that made my breath catch. "Maybe I'm just enjoying the quiet," I replied softly, my voice almost trembling with the weight of everything left unsaid. He chuckled, and the sound was low, soft, filling the space between us. "Quiet can be nice," he said, his tone thoughtful. "It makes you notice things you'd normally miss." His gaze dropped to our hands resting inches apart on the sofa, and slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his hand, brushing his fingertips along mine. It was the lightest of touches, but it sent a ripple of warmth through me. We sat like that for a long moment, suspended in a silence that felt thick with tension. I didn't pull my hand away, and neither did he. Instead, his fingers intertwined with mine, and I felt the warmth of his skin, the strength in his grip. My heart hammered, and I knew in that instant that this moment was teetering on the edge of something we couldn't take back. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered, his voice tinged with hesitation. But his hand remained on mine, his thumb tracing gentle circles across my skin, sending shivers up my spine. "Me neither," I replied, barely able to get the words out. I was painfully aware of every point of contact between us, the way his leg brushed against mine, the warmth of his body so close to mine. I could feel a pull, an undeniable attraction that both thrilled and terrified me. For a long moment we just sat there, our hands entwined, neither of us daring to move. It felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of us, our breaths in sync, the quiet intimacy building into something neither of us could ignore. Then, without another word, David lifted his hand, his fingers brushing softly against my cheek, tracing a line down to my jaw. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and I felt my eyes flutter closed at the warmth of it. When I opened them, he was closer, his face inches from mine, his gaze flickering to my lips before meeting my eyes again. My breath caught, and in that moment I knew. This was the point of no return, the moment where everything would change. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned in, his lips hovering just a breath away from mine. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the soft exhale of his breath against my skin, and every nerve in my body was alight, buzzing with anticipation. Then, finally, his lips met mine. The kiss was soft, tentative, as if he was testing the waters, giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into it, letting my hand slide up to his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth beneath my fingertips. His hand moved to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and the kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more intense. In that moment, the rest of the world disappeared. There was only the feel of his lips, the softness of his breath mingling with mine, the way his hand moved to cradle the back of my head, pulling me even closer. I lost myself in the sensation, in the warmth and the softness and the quiet thrill of finally giving in to something I hadn't realized I wanted so desperately. We broke apart only when we were both breathless, and as I looked up at him I saw the same longing reflected in his gaze, a need that mirrored my own. Neither of us spoke. There was no need. Everything that needed to be said was there, unspoken, hanging in the air between us. But as the silence stretched, I felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of doubt creeping in. This was my husband's friend, the man who had been a part of our lives for years. And yet, as I looked at David, saw the vulnerability in his eyes, I knew that something had changed. This moment, this connection was something neither of us could ignore or deny. "David," I started, my voice barely a whisper. He placed a finger to my lips, silencing me with a gentle smile. "I know," he said softly, his voice full of understanding. "I feel it too." We sat there in silence, his hand still holding mine, his thumb tracing soft, comforting circles across my skin. I didn't know what the future held or how we would navigate this, but in that moment all that mattered was the undeniable connection we'd found. The night stretched on, each second passing in a quiet, shared understanding. And as he leaned in for another kiss, I knew that we were stepping into uncharted territory, bound by a connection neither of us could undo. Our second kiss was deeper, unrestrained, a surrender to the pull that had been building between us all night. This time there was no hesitation, no lingering doubt. I felt his hand sliding up my back, firm yet gentle, and I leaned into him, letting the warmth of his body ground me. Every touch felt like a confession, a silent admission of all the unspoken words between us. My fingers found their way to his hair, twisting into the soft strands as I pulled him closer, our breaths mingling in the quiet of the living room. The fire's glow danced around us, casting shadows that seemed to flicker in time with the rapid beat of my heart. Each kiss was a step closer to crossing an invisible line, a boundary that once crossed would change everything. As we broke apart, I opened my eyes and found him looking at me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. His eyes were filled with something deeper than mere attraction, something I hadn't seen in a long time. In that moment, I felt truly seen, as though he understood every thought, every hidden feeling I had tried to bury. "Sarah," he murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers lingering against my cheek. The tenderness in his touch made my heart ache, filling the empty spaces I hadn't even realized were there. I knew I should say something, anything to break the tension, to ground myself before I lost my grip completely, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, letting his warmth surround me, envelop me. My heart felt both heavy and light, as though it was floating in a place where time didn't exist, where only this moment mattered. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his hand sliding down to rest against my shoulder, grounding me, holding me steady as I felt myself tipping over the edge of something unknown. I nodded, unable to form a coherent reply. Every nerve in my body was awake, alive, humming with a tension that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I wanted to stop, to take a step back, but I also knew that I couldn't. I was caught, tangled in this web of desire and unspoken emotion that bound us together in a way that felt both familiar and completely new. He seemed to understand, and without another word he pulled me close again, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was both gentle and insistent, as if he too was surrendering to the pull between us. This time there was a sense of inevitability, a quiet acceptance of the line we were about to cross. My hand slid over his shoulders, feeling the strength beneath his shirt, the solid warmth that seemed to seep into me, steadying the whirlwind of emotions swirling in my chest. As our kisses deepened, everything else faded away, the guilt, the worry, even the quiet hum of the world beyond this room. There was only us, lost in a moment that felt endless, each touch, each soft brush of his lips leaving me breathless, wanting more. Before I knew it, he was guiding me back onto the sofa, his hands gentle yet firm as he pulled me close, our bodies pressed together in a way that felt both grounding and exhilarating. His fingers traced slow, delicate patterns along my arm, sending shivers down my spine, and I found myself melting into him, letting go of the last remnants of hesitation that had held me back. Time seemed to slow as we explored each other, every touch, every whisper filled with a quiet urgency that only deepened the connection between us. His hand slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer, and I could feel the steady beat of his heart against mine, grounding me, holding me in place as I felt myself falling, sinking deeper into the warmth and intensity of the moment. And then, as if sensing my thoughts, he pulled back slightly, his gaze searching mine. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, filled with a gentleness that made my heart ache. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I simply nodded, letting my hand rest against his cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingers. The silence stretched between us, filled with an understanding that needed no words. Slowly he leaned in, pressing his forehead to mine, and in that quiet, intimate gesture I felt everything, the weight of our connection, the tenderness, the desire, the understanding. We sat like that for what felt like an eternity, our breaths mingling, our foreheads pressed together as we held onto each other in the stillness of the room. And then, without another word, he tilted my chin up, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was slow, deep, filled with a raw, unspoken emotion that made my heart race. As we pulled each other closer, I felt a tear slip down my cheek, a single tear that held all the conflicted emotions, the longing, the fear, and the quiet acceptance of the line we were crossing together. David brushed it away with his thumb, his gaze soft, understanding, and he smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile that made my heart feel as though it was finally whole. We moved together slowly, each touch, each kiss filled with a tenderness that felt timeless, as if we were savoring every second, every moment. There was no rush, no urgency, only a deep, quiet understanding that this was something real, something that went beyond the fleeting spark of attraction. This was a connection that felt rooted in something deeper, something neither of us could explain. As the night stretched on, we remained entangled in each other, our hands exploring, our lips meeting in soft, lingering kisses that held a promise, a silent vow that whatever came next, we would face it together. Every touch, every glance felt like a declaration, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between us in this quiet, stolen moment. Finally, as dawn began to creep through the windows, casting a soft glow over the room, we lay there, our bodies entwined, his arm wrapped around me as I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet contentment that filled the empty spaces I hadn't even realized were there. In the silence, David's fingers traced gentle patterns along my back, grounding me, keeping me tethered to this moment, to the reality of what we had shared. And as I closed my eyes, I knew that whatever the future held, this moment would stay with me, a memory etched into my heart, a reminder of the night we had crossed a line that could never be undone. The morning light bathed us in a warmth that felt almost surreal, as though the world outside had paused, giving us this quiet moment to ourselves. David shifted, pulling me closer, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face, his gaze soft, filled with an unspoken promise. "I don't regret a single moment," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. His fingers tightened around mine, grounding me in the reality of his words, and I felt my heart swell, a warmth spreading through me that was both comforting and terrifying. "Neither do I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. The truth of it settled over us, binding us together in a way that felt both exhilarating and irreversible. There was no going back, no way to unsee, to unfeel the connection we had found in each other. As the sun rose higher, casting its warm glow over the room, we sat together, our hands intertwined, lost in a quiet, shared understanding that whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. And as we exchanged one last lingering kiss, I knew that this was only the beginning of something that would change us both forever. We stayed like that for a while, sitting close, our fingers still intertwined, as if neither of us was ready to let go of the magic that had settled around us. The living room felt different now, transformed by the night we had shared, filled with an unspoken connection that couldn't be undone. But reality crept in, slowly but surely, and as the morning sun illuminated the room, I felt a flicker of anxiety. What would happen now? The boundaries we'd crossed could never be uncrossed, and the truth of it hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. My mind began to spin with the implications, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt, an ache for what I had allowed to unfold. David must have sensed it, because he gently squeezed my hand, pulling me out of my spiraling thoughts. He looked at me, his gaze steady, filled with that same warmth that had drawn me to him in the first place. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," he murmured, his voice calm, reassuring. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out." I nodded, taking a deep breath, letting his words settle over me like a balm. His calmness, his certainty steadied me, reminded me that I wasn't alone in this, that we were in this together, whatever this might turn out to be. I offered him a small smile, grateful for his patience, for the way he seemed to understand everything I was feeling without me having to say a word. He lifted my hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to my knuckles, and my heart swelled with a confusing blend of gratitude, affection, and something deeper, something I didn't dare put a name to yet. But the warmth in his gaze, the silent promise in his touch, was enough to reassure me, if only for now. We lingered in that quiet intimacy for a while longer, savoring the last moments before the reality of the day would pull us back. Eventually we rose, and he helped me gather our things, our hands brushing occasionally as we moved around the living room. Each touch, each glance felt loaded with meaning, a reminder of everything we had shared in the quiet hours of the night. As we reached the door, he turned to face me, his hand lingering on the doorframe, as if he too was reluctant to leave. He looked at me, his gaze soft, full of that same unspoken promise, and for a moment I wished we could stay like this forever, wrapped in the warmth of our shared secret. "Take care of yourself." "Okay," he said softly, his voice filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. I nodded, unable to trust my voice, and he gave me a gentle smile before stepping out into the morning light, leaving me standing in the doorway, feeling both empty and full, as if a piece of him had been left behind, woven into the fabric of the home we had shared for that brief, beautiful night. As the door closed, the silence settled around me, heavier now, filled with the weight of what we had become. I sat down on the sofa, running my fingers over the fabric, feeling the lingering warmth where we had sat together, a memory etched into every fiber, every quiet corner of the room. The day passed slowly, a blur of mundane tasks that felt surreal in the wake of what had happened. Every now and then I would catch myself lost in thought, my mind drifting back to his touch, the warmth of his embrace, the way he had looked at me, as if I were the only person in the world. But as the hours ticked by, the reality of what we had done began to sink in, the weight of our actions pressing down on me. I felt a swirl of emotions, joy, guilt, longing, fear, all twisting together in a tangled knot that I couldn't unravel. What would happen now? How would this change things between us, between him and my husband, between all of us? That evening, as I sat alone in the quiet house, I replayed every moment in my mind, savoring the memory of his touch, the warmth of his kiss, the way he had held me as if I were something precious, something worth holding on to. And yet the questions lingered, haunting me, filling the spaces between those cherished memories with a sense of uncertainty, a fear of what might come next. The days that followed were a strange blend of longing and restraint. David and I saw each other only in passing, brief moments where our eyes would meet, a shared glance that held 1,000 unspoken words. It was as if we were both holding our breath, waiting, unsure of what to do, of how to navigate the quiet ache that had settled between us. One evening, a few weeks later, I was at a gathering with friends and family. David was there too, of course, and from across the room our eyes met. There was a flicker of something, recognition, longing, perhaps a touch of regret, but we both looked away, caught in the delicate dance of hiding something that felt too big, too consuming to contain. I found myself drifting through the night, my mind half absent, lost in the memory of that night, of everything we had shared and everything we had left unsaid. And as I moved through the room, smiling, laughing, playing my part, I felt his presence at my side, a subtle shadow that I couldn't shake, an ache that I knew would always linger, reminding me of the line we had crossed. Eventually, as the evening drew to a close, David approached me, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady yet filled with an undercurrent of something deeper, something only I could see. "Can we talk?" he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to echo through the room, pulling me out of my reverie. I nodded, and together we slipped out into the cool night air, finding a quiet corner away from the others. He stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, caught in the silence, the weight of everything we had left unsaid pressing down on us. "Sarah," he began softly, his voice filled with a quiet vulnerability that made my heart ache. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you, about us that night. It changed everything for me." I looked down, my heart pounding, the flood of emotions I had been trying to bury rising to the surface. I know I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It changed everything for me too." He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine, and the familiar warmth of his touch brought a sense of comfort, a feeling of belonging that I hadn't felt in years. We stood like that, lost in the quiet connection that had brought us together, the unspoken understanding that had bound us since that night. "I don't know what the future holds," he murmured, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I do know that I can't go back to pretending that I don't feel this way about you." His words hung in the air, a quiet confession that held both fear and hope, and I felt my own heart echoing his, caught in the same conflict, the same longing for something we both knew was as impossible as it was undeniable. "I don't want to pretend either," I replied, my voice trembling with the weight of the truth I had been hiding, "but I don't know what to do. Everything feels so complicated." He nodded, his grip on my hand tightening, a silent reassurance that whatever came next, we would face it together. And in that quiet moment, standing under the stars, I felt a sense of peace, a calm certainty that whatever happened, our connection was real, something worth holding on to, no matter how impossible it might seem. We shared a lingering look, a silent promise that this wasn't the end, that somehow, someway we would find a way to navigate the uncertain path that lay before us. And as he leaned in, pressing a soft, gentle kiss to my forehead, I knew that this was just the beginning of a journey we would face together, no matter what challenges lay ahead. As the days passed, a quiet understanding settled between us, something unspoken yet unmistakable. Life carried on around us, family gatherings, shared conversations with mutual friends, moments where we caught each other's gaze across a crowded room. Each glance held a secret language that only we understood, a reminder of the night that had forever changed us. But as much as we tried to savor those moments, there was an undeniable tension, an ache that grew harder to ignore with each passing day. The weight of reality pressed in from all sides, reminding us that what we shared, as beautiful and true as it felt, existed in a fragile world that could shatter at any moment. One evening, as I sat alone in my living room, memories of our night together washed over me with a bittersweet clarity. The way he had held me, the warmth of his touch, the unspoken promises in his eyes, all of it felt as vivid as if it had just happened. But beneath the longing, a quiet sadness crept in, a sense of inevitability that I could no longer ignore. David and I hadn't spoken about what would come next. We were both caught in a limbo, balancing between the life we knew and the unknown path our connection seemed to promise. And as much as I wanted to cling to the memory of our night together, I knew that something had to change. That night I received a message from him, a simple, direct note asking if we could meet. I knew, without even reading between the lines, that this wasn't just a casual request. There was a finality to his words, an unspoken understanding that we both needed closure, even if it meant facing the painful truth of what we couldn't have. We met in a quiet park, the sun just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over everything. David was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench beneath a large oak tree, his gaze lost in the distance. As I approached, he looked up, his eyes filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. "Thank you for meeting me," he said softly, standing as I reached him. There was a heaviness in his voice, a quiet resignation that made my heart ache. I nodded, unable to find the words, and we sat together in silence, the weight of everything we'd left unsaid pressing down on us. For a long while, neither of us spoke, each lost in our own thoughts, caught between the desire to hold on and the painful knowledge of what we both knew had to happen. "Sarah," he began, his voice barely a whisper. He paused, as if gathering his thoughts, and when he looked at me, there was a raw honesty in his eyes that took my breath away. What we shared, it was real, and it meant everything to me. A tear slipped down my cheek, and I brushed it away, nodding as I tried to hold back the flood of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. "It meant everything to me too," I replied, my voice trembling. "I'll never forget it." We sat there, hands intertwined, clinging to the final moments we had together, each touch a bittersweet reminder of the bond we had shared. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of twilight, David reached out, his fingers brushing my cheek, wiping away a tear that had escaped. "I wish things could be different," he murmured, his voice filled with regret. "I wish I could give you the world, but I don't want you to live a life of secrets and half-truths. You deserve more than that." His words, as painful as they were, resonated deep within me, echoing the doubts and fears I had tried to ignore. I knew he was right. Our connection, as beautiful as it was, existed in the shadows, a hidden piece of our lives that could never truly thrive in the light. We shared one last, lingering embrace, holding onto each other as if we could somehow freeze time, keep this moment from slipping away. His warmth, his steady heartbeat, the comfort of his arms, all of it was seared into my memory, a piece of him I would carry with me forever. When we finally pulled apart, he pressed a gentle kiss to my forehead, a final quiet goodbye that held all the love, the longing, and the pain we couldn't put into words. "Take care of yourself, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always be here in whatever way you need me." I nodded, unable to speak, and as I watched him walk away, each step taking him farther from me, I felt a sense of finality settle over me. The ache was almost unbearable, but beneath it there was a quiet strength, a sense of peace that came from knowing we had shared something real, something beautiful, even if it couldn't last. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a kind of normalcy, the routines and rhythms of daily life pulling me forward, guiding me through the quiet moments of grief and acceptance. David and I remained friends, our bond forever altered but still grounded in the respect and understanding we had always shared. And though the ache lingered, a quiet reminder of what we had lost, there was a part of me that felt grateful. Grateful for the love we had shared, however fleeting, and for the way it had reminded me of what it meant to feel truly alive. Looking back, I realized that night in the living room had been a gift, a moment of connection that had brought me closer to myself, to my own capacity for love, for vulnerability. And though our paths had diverged, leaving us with memories that would forever be ours alone, I knew that a piece of him would always be with me, woven into the fabric of who I had become. In the quiet moments when the house was still and the world seemed to fade away, I would think of him, feel the ghost of his touch, the warmth of his embrace, and smile, grateful for the love that had, if only briefly, filled my heart.